For the last 2 years, a developer has been looking to breathe new life into the empty Emerson Power Transmission site on Ithaca's South Hill. But now, just as the development process continues to move forward, questions have come up about the site's industrial past and just how that might impact its future. And joining us by phone to provide a little more context on what all that means is the Ithaca Times Michael Nocella. Michael, thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Always a pleasure, Sam.
So, just to start with the basics, can you lay out for us what's actually been happening up at the Emerson Power Transmission site?
Yeah, so Unchained Properties, which is owned by David Lubin, who's a developer, started about a couple years ago, as you mentioned, looking at the Emerson Transmission power site. And his vision for it is turning the whole 95-acre property, which is 800,000 square foot of already developed building, and kind of renovating it into mixed use, which would include residential, commercial, and industrial uses. So they've been in the process of kind of mapping out what that vision would look like if it's possible. What makes it really tricky is that the property, which is massive, spans both the town and the city. So for any kind of development to take place on the site as a whole, you need both municipalities on the same page, both signing off on anything that would happen there. Another challenge is obviously, if a site's been used for heavy industrial use for, the last century, there's probably going to be some stuff underground or even on top of ground or groundwater, the soil, that's not going to be conducive to developing homes for people to live in. You got a lot of different contaminants that have been hanging up there for a long time. So they're in the midst of kind of looking at what's there, how long it's been there, can we get it out, do we need to get it out, do we just need to know that it's there, all that fun stuff to make sure that this is even possible before they sign off and make the transaction of buying the property.
So when did the site actually stop being used as an industrial facility?
And I think it's been in decline for decades, but I think maybe it's been completely defunct for maybe 20 years or so now. I know they started doing environmental studies on it, not Unchained Properties, but other people have looked at the site since the 1970s. Overall, nearly 1,000 different locations on the property have been assessed with environmental findings in mind. This latest study is over 500 different locations, and of those, they've identified 18 environmental conditions that warrant more evaluation. They don't know what's quite there. At this point, their engineers and their environmental brain trust have stated that they haven't found anything that's too concerning at the moment. Obviously, that can change. So they're just in the midst of really finding out what's there and then what remediation would need to take place to bring it from an industrial to a residential, commercial, mixed-use property.
And what have they actually found on the site? You mentioned that from this last study, they're still looking into those findings, but in the history of studies that's been done on that site, what's turned up in the ground and in the groundwater up there?
So there's four main things that have kind of produced these contaminants throughout the years. One is oil quenching, one is heat treatment, one is their fire water reservoir, and the other is just on-site waste fill, which is kind of spread throughout the property. But some of the contaminants that have been mentioned are barium, cyanide, pre-petroleum products, metals in the soil, chlorinated solvents, and trichloroethylene, or what's known as TCE, is another one. And the TCE has kind of throughout the years trickled down the hill and has been found in some South Hill residents' properties already. So that's kind of why some residents around the area are already on high alert. They're saying, well, if my home isn't even on the property but has been impacted by this site, what's that going to mean for a home that's going to be built directly on the site?
Of course, and considering that all those contaminants have been found, have they been at levels that people should really be concerned about?
Well, at this time, all the team is saying that I think engineer Daniel Null, who's kind of leading the study right now. He said up to this point, they haven't really found anything that would warrant significant remediation, probably just more long-term monitoring and just knowing where stuff is and what they can do with those conditions in mind. But he said it's still possible that, there's going to do a little excavation or digging up soil, or it might need significant excavation. They're just not quite sure at this time what the site's going to need.
And maybe, do they have a sense for what those possible remediation techniques could be? Are we talking removing a top layer of soil? Like, are they exploring these options at this point?
Yeah, so, there's a few different things they can do, depends on how bad some of the sites are on the property. Like I said, one is it's been explained to me that just knowing what's there, where it is, and how bad it is in itself is a form of remediation. The next step would be possibly excavation, where you dig up some soil and remove it from the site. Another method is something that's called in situ, and that's where instead of removing soil from the site, they'll just simply inject contaminated soil or concrete with other chemicals that kind of combat or neutralize the existing contaminants. And in terms of groundwater, sites like this, commonly you either just kind of do a long-term monitoring where every now and then you go in there and check to make sure that the water's still fine and hasn't gotten any worse. But if it continues to get worse, or if it's already bad enough to begin with, that's when you would excavate the water and take that out there and remove it from the site. So they're still in the process of figuring out what methods of remediation need to be used, and I think later on this year, I want to say the end of December, early 2015, they hope to have those answers, because then they'll be moving on to their generic environmental impact statement, at which time they need to know the answers to the things we're talking about right now.
Of course. And one thing that I think is hard to not think about when talking about this site is the fact that this site is not singular in Ithaca. There's the Gun Hill site, which is similarly located on top of a hill, and has been undergoing this pretty long-term remediation that is still not yet finished. So I'm wondering, do you know of any other sites kind of in this area, maybe in central New York, that have really been well remediated?
Well, nothing certainly to this scale of, this is really Ithaca's main industrial site. So nothing to this scale has been remediated at a local level, but there are similar projects that have been kind of alluded to throughout this process, throughout the country, in which it is common to take defunct industrial sites and remediate them and renovate them into places where you could live, work, and play. So it's not unprecedented, uncharted waters, but even the sites that they kind of alluded to in the presentation as similar comparisons warrant this site. This site is very unique. It's got bedrock, it's elevated, it's a very unique beast, and they even admitted as much, saying that, while some things might compare to this that have been done in other places, this is probably a little more complicated. So it'll be interesting to see if this can actually move forward.
Mm-hmm. And thinking about that future and moving forward, how are the city and town maybe working together to help this thing along?
So it's actually been kind of a pain in the neck for the Chainworks team, which are trying to kind of they're trying to do a better job of, and hopefully for my sake as well, because they've been giving essentially the same meeting twice for everything they do. So they need to do a better job of maybe getting everyone in the same room so they can just do things one time. They've been going to both city planning and town planning for whether it's a scoping session or whether it's just to pitch the initial concept. They've been doing everything twice, so it's been kind of a grueling process. But the city just declared itself lead agency, so that might help get things on the fast track, so to speak, in terms of they might not have to take everything to the town, and maybe just a couple of the town officials will sit in on some of the meetings with the city or something like that. It is unprecedented. process. So everyone is just kind of giving their best guess of what's the best way to go about this.
So thinking about the fact again that the Emerson Power Transmission site is not alone, there is Gun Hill, but both of these sites are being focused on because there are developers interested in developing. So I'm wondering if you think it says anything about our local governments, the city and the town, that it kind of takes this push from an outside developer to get them interested in cleaning up these sites, as opposed to the city and town taking the initiative to actually get the cleanups completed on their own.
Well, I think it's probably a tricky process, because these properties are still owned by, for instance, Emerson's still owned by Emerson. So, and it's their responsibility to do any cleanup on the site. So for Emerson, there's nothing there or nothing that's been found that's endangering Ithaca as it is. It's still well qualified and clean enough to be an industrial site. The reason that cleanup would be needed is because if you want to use it for residential, that's a whole new ballgame. Then, yeah, it's probably not clean enough to do that. So I think it's when these outside people come with these ideas to make something a residential or commercial site that wasn't used for that previously, that's when these cleanups need to happen. And that's when someone has to pay for that to make it happen. So I don't really think that's on the city and town. That's on the developers who want to invest and make their visions, happen. So it's probably a very complicated process.
Michael Nocella is a reporter for the Ithaca Times. You can read his story about the cleanup of the Emerson Power Transmission site in last week's edition of the Ithaca Times. Michael, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to chat.
All right, happy holidays, sir.